which is indeed that we must look at urban development as something more than urban planning. We still need to plan. It's also a very functional thing to make a city. It's where does the garbage go? Where's the sewage system, and et cetera, power, and all that. But we should look at urban form, urban morphology as kind of an innovation process. It's much more complicated than just placing volumes. It's about, as you say, how do we socialize? Where do we connect? How do we meet? How do we understand the touch points of everyday people's lives? How does our lives, so to say, intertwine in each other's realities? And of course, there's not an easy answer to this. It's not like, okay, Christian, he has the formula. This is how you do it. But it's rather that now the question is almost totally absent. I mean, some good architects, of course, will mention it. Some good planners will reflect on it more or less actively. But on the political agenda, it's almost absent. Also in Scandinavia, maybe not so much in Denmark and Norway, is totally absent. So all innovation money goes to tech stuff and to reducing CO2, which is good. But there's almost no innovation investment in our built environment, which I think is such a weird thing. And that's what we're saying. We're saying we need to rewire the public systems, public-private systems, and the collaborative models between public and private actors to pursue a golden path to better neighborhoods.
Hello and welcome to the Idea Sandbox podcast. I'm your host, Rajiv. Today, I had the absolute pleasure and privilege of hosting Christian Pagh from Oslo, Norway. Christian is the director of the Oslo Triennale, which is an architectural event that occurs once in 3 years in Norway. Why am I chatting with Christian and somebody who's an architect? Well, I've been always fascinated by European architecture. I think it's incredibly beautiful. A lot of things seems common sense to me. Overall, the general style aesthetic is very appealing to me. So I wanted to get at the roots of how a culture comes up with some of these designs, some of these ideas, and how does a society come together to build something so unique and pretty. Christian had a different viewpoint than me on a lot of these things, and I thought it was fascinating. Christian is trained in philosophy and culture as it pertains to architecture. So that was very interesting for me to talk to him about that and how as a community we are integral to the design of our neighborhoods. We have to participate is kind of the contention of Christian and the book that they're putting out, Mission Neighborhoods, which is fascinating. It's a lot of evidence-based design of neighborhoods, design of cities. It goes a little bit against what we've been used to, where real estate and commercial interests build something in the interest of profiteering as well as not taking as many risks. But Christian's, or I should say the Mission Neighborhood book's contention is that we're all in on this. We all have to participate, and the onus is upon us to build better neighborhoods as we increase the joy that comes with building better neighborhoods and living in better neighborhoods. And I completely agree with him. We had a ton of fun talking about this and many more topics. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I had having it. It's not a long conversation like some of my other podcasts. It's about an hour long. So please enjoy, grab a coffee or something, and give me feedback again, please. Please subscribe and like. I want to keep making this kind of content and sharing with you guys. Love and peace. Thanks. All right, let's get into it, Christian. Hey, thank you for, this is Friday afternoon for you in Norway, right? Mm-hmm. And you doing this with me, man, sir. I don't know how you want me. Can I be informal with you, Christian?
Yeah, well, we Scandinavians, we go the informal way.
Okay, good deal. You probably are one of the 3 Scandinavian people I've met in my life, to be honest with you. And so this is this is so out of my comfort zone. But I mean, as I was reading the book, and I'm thinking man, why didn't I know Scandinavian people, like Scandinavian culture earlier? Because there's so much to admire. There's so much to kind of take lessons from you guys as far as just building a city or thinking in the sense of the community and the broader good versus the the individualistic kind of like, let me just look out for myself and all. Anyway, I'll get into all of that. I don't want to get into all of that right away. Christian, I guess, are you ready? Can we get started?
I am ready. I'm all yours.
Okay. Okay. So first of all, thank you. I did my best to read through the book. It was a big book, and there's a lot to get into, and it's fascinating. A lot of things. Would you say it's like kind of like I don't know. I don't want to mischaracterize the book. Is it like a manifesto? It's more like, hey, do this, like kind of prescriptive ideas on how to make your neighborhoods better and things like that. Would that be fair to characterize the book as?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say. I guess to some extent, I am more and more convinced that we need to propose solutions and to be fairly concrete. I think there are many people out there who basically would like to do things good, in a certain sense, optimistic on behalf of mankind, though there's a lot of reasons not to be right now, looking at the crisis and the wars, etc. But I actually think that many people would like to do good, but they don't necessarily know how. And of course, it's about trust, and it's about knowledge, it's about incentives, it's about structural change. And I guess we are trying to be as direct and as pedagogical as we can, while acknowledging, of course, that urban issues and urban planning and ambitions of making our urban environments better, it's highly complicated material. It's things are intertwined, etc. So acknowledging the fact that it is complicated, but there are plenty of things that we already know, that this is stupid, this does not work, it's a bad idea. So let's start with what we know in a way. So yes, it's true. It's slightly, let's say, manifesto. It's like yes, this is important. Let's do it. And it's also trying to be somewhat operational, coming up with concrete advice. And also we have asked our, I think, 35 contributors to be concrete and also to offer advice. So many of the contributions in the book, their articles and interviews, etc., they end up with 3 pieces of advice. And of course, you could say, is that a little bit banal? Yeah, but I'd rather be direct and then being opaque about what we want to say.
And abstract and up to interpretation and things like that. I guess to be fully honest with you about some of the motivations behind this podcast is that I've always been kind of fascinated by European architecture. I've visited Europe a couple of times, just a few countries, not to the Scandinavian countries, but the Northern European, Western European countries. And it's always occurred to me that, man, you guys, when I say you guys, I mean Europe as a continent. In general, when I turn on a video on YouTube or TV or whatever, everything is just beautiful. Everything is just like aesthetically pleasing. A lot of things make sense. Like, I remember in Switzerland, there were these kind of kiosks for men to go take a leak, and it was just like a kiosk about yay height, and you just kind of stood there and did your thing. Everybody could see you, like, standing up, but they couldn't see your private parts and stuff. And it's like, oh great, that's practical, and so I always was like, kind of like, I need to talk to somebody. Actually, I spoke to, I don't know if you've heard of Chris Bruntlet. He's the Dutch cycling embassy guy. Okay, good deal. So I had him on the podcast, actually, precisely for the same reasons. I just really wanted to know what were the thought processes behind it. So that's kind of like the theme or the general mood as to why I want to get into this conversation and how I would get into it. I guess before we get started, Christian, could you describe what your background is? I mean, you were, I guess, trained in modern culture and philosophy. That was your degree, I believe. And what, I guess, could you describe what your current role is as an architect, I guess, of Oslo, the Triennale? I looked it up. I kind of educated myself what a Triennale is. I didn't even know what the word was. Can you kind of describe your... Yeah, okay. And can you describe to me why modern culture and philosophy, and how does that tie into architecture?
Sure. Where to start? Yeah, I guess to some extent I was always interested in how how we are formed as communities. What makes you feel at home in a place? It could be a bar or a school or on the street or in a neighborhood. So I think most people quite intuitively sense when a place resonates, when it kind of makes you feel good or makes you feel scared or etc. Right? So I think there's kind of and this goes for indoor and outdoor. Like basically, as a human being, we're being framed by our physical and social surroundings, and how that happens always kind of intrigued me. And my first job after graduating, indeed, from modern culture and philosophy, was working with a big competition for culture center in Denmark, and that led me to understand how building processes work, how you make a competition, how it's orchestrated, what are the processes behind what's being built, and that fascinated me enormously. It was again complicated. Many things were great, some things were stupid. I was interested in how come that. And that is the case even in Scandinavia, I'm afraid to say. How come so much end up so bad? With all the good intentions and even resources, etc. How come so much end up like slightly off, a little bit stupid, ugly, turning the wrong way, you know, all this kind of like. And to fast forward, I spent some 12 years as a consultant. I had a few design companies in different constellations that kind of specialized. We called it culture design. So let's say, following this interest of how does the spatial and the social cultural, how does that meet? And that meets, of course, very directly in a new urban area. Where do people meet? Where's the social infrastructure or a cultural institution or a hotel? And I mean, all these places, they somehow relate to a physical structure, but also a content or a program, I should say, in architecture language. So anyways, that's been my interest, and it's still I'm crazy about these things. I think it's really interesting, and I think there's a lot to learn, and some are really good, and a lot of people don't think about it, and it gets me frustrated. But then my current position is Director and Chief Curator of the Oslo Architecture Triennale, and as most people don't know, that is it's a festival or an event that happens every 3 years. So every 3 years, there's a big event. It's a national event going on in Oslo that then explores architecture and urban issues, etc. And then as a chief curator, I then put Mission Neighborhood Reforming Communities as the theme of the 2022 Triennale, inviting a lot of architects and activists and politicians and bureaucrats, etc., developers to join the conversation of what makes a good neighborhood. And how do we inform them better? What are the processes that we can rethink or refine to get a better result? Can we rethink urban governance? And then the book is let's say the result of the Triennale, kind of a sum up of all the things or a lot of the perspectives and projects we kind of encountered, and we want to try to give them on to the urban community.
This is another curiosity question. Like, it seems like is design and architecture and aesthetics, like, is that front and center? Like, is that a very important part of American culture? Like, for example, if you go look at California, Silicon Valley, that's the name of the game. That's the biggest game in town. Everybody goes to be a programmer. They want to make it big and things like that. Like, if you go to California, at least Southern California, that's the kind of not Southern California, but San Francisco and that area, you're imbued with that across the board. Is that in Europe? Are you socialized as a kid? Is that even like at the home level, like everything, make things look beautiful? Like, don't just kind of slap things together for functionality. Make sure that everything looks kind of symmetrical, has right proportions, as things look beautiful. Is that kind of like instilled in you as kids even?
I guess to some extent, though there also, I would say, differences, of course, in Europe being a diverse cup of tea. I would maybe argue that in Danish culture, there's a very kind of rooted design culture. Both, let's say, an interest in design as something beautiful or, let's say, symmetrical or kind of the way things appear. But I think maybe in Denmark and even maybe more Norway, this design is also considered a kind of a question of social design, designing for the common good. It's also a question of, is it reasonable? Can everybody be a part of it? So it's kind of an extended, let's say, design understanding beyond just pretty and good looking. It's also, is it functional? Does it help people? Is it for everybody? So when I had the most optimistic perspective of my home country, so I'm Danish, even though I live in Oslo, is when we have this kind of, let's say, extended design culture. In Norway, I'm a little bit more. So I'm also, let's say, excited about the Scandinavian context, that I think we do a lot of things right, and there's a lot of, let's say, we tax the rich and give to the poor, and we have an extensive welfare system that I truly am grateful for and proud of. But maybe specifically in the Norwegian context, I find that urban planning and urban development is very driven by private capital, and is frankly fairly short-sighted and often just plain ugly and greedy, and as you see everywhere, So maybe in the Norwegian context, I find that the social design aspect oddly absent in urban planning. So it's also specific. But I guess in my head, it's totally intertwined. So it's like, and it's almost like I want to turn it off sometimes. So when I go down the street, it's like, oh, it hurts my eyes when I see, why the fuck did they build it that way? Why didn't they turn it the other way so you had a little square? I see, like, it's like, it hurts my eyes and my soul when I see all bad solutions. And the other way around. So I can also get really excited when I see this kind of like, wow, that's a good solution. They kind of enabled this little meeting place here by moving the, etc.
Yeah, that's so underappreciated. I share that sentiment with you, Christian. Is that when I go to certain neighborhoods, or I'm like, man, this is such an eyesore. I can't. Like it even starts in my own like studio, my garage that I made my studio in. Like if there's a wire that's kind of running randomly across when I'm working, it's an eyesore. It's a distraction. It's unharmonious in some ways. It's just like it just doesn't fit. And I think I wasn't born this way. I think moving to America enabled a lot of this to me. I'm not saying that we don't have that kind of sentiment, but it just immediately kind of like, and then I'm married to an American, and so she kind of socialized me into that kind of like, hey, things should not look ugly. Things should look kind of more pleasing to the eyes. And the term "easy on the eyes" kind of I've never heard that before. So.
But even though I think we agree, Rajiv, I want to qualify it a little bit, because I think when it comes to the urban realm, it's also important not to demand that everything should be necessarily beautiful or let's say pretty or orderly. So I think what makes them a good neighborhood is not necessarily that it's pretty, though I also like when things are beautiful. But it's about how things are human and how things can happen. So it's not so much how it looks, it's what the environment enables. Can you meet somebody? Can you hang out? Can you play basketball? Can you is it safe for kids to walk on the streets? It's how an urban area performs, because you can see many things, right? So you can see just an ugly neighborhood, but you can also see a super well organized but deadly boring and over controlled neighborhood where nothing happens, because it's just like some janitors just kind of over regulated the whole deal. So I think it's quite important to make a distinction between, let's say, design for beauty, which is also important, and I think it's its own conversation, and design for a rich human life. And I think there it's also a question of performativity. What opportunities do you enable? So sometimes maybe we need to clean up a little bit less. We need to leave it be. We need to just use it as it is. Don't renovate it. Just let it simmer a little bit, like slow cooking. I think there's kind of also an obsession of making things look good. But what if we just made somebody take care of it for 10 years and see what happens? Also leaving place for the open-ended and also to some extent even the uncontrollable. Because I think that's an aspect of urban planning that it's really quite dominant in the Western world, is like, let's control it, let's make it regulated, and then everybody ends up at home watching Netflix. They don't hang out, they don't meet, and that's the whole problem.
Yeah, do you think this kind of, I mean, it seems like we're in kind of an experimental phase of like a post-industrial revolution. This is the first time we're all kind of like coming together as societies and urbanizing and things like that, right? Like in a large scale. Do you think this is kind of like the teething problems we're coming through? Like we did it the very controlled way, and then now we're like, okay, maybe we need to have a little bit of that messiness integrated or left alone so that we have that kind of serendipity in our interactions. And there's beauty, there's utility to it, like you mentioned, like people coming together, sharing ideas, being happy. This whole idea of I wrote this down: joy as a therapy for society, right? Like I mean, I could not agree more with you. In the US, like I live in a small city in the Midwest. I really don't see these. Like when I was growing up in my late teens, early 20s in India, we had this kind of like that, a smaller version, a micro version of that neighborhood concept where me and my buddies would hang out. And it was a smaller kind of a compact neighborhood where people would go to this movie hall, would come out, and people watch. That's the other thing you bring up in the book, is people watching is a very kind of a fulfilling thing for humans to do. It's a joyful thing. Like that would happen so that people would file out of the theater or go into the cinema, and we would watch that, and we would all hang out for 3 or 4 hours. And I remember to this day, it was one of the most joyful 3 or 4 hours I spent every single day for almost 3 or 4 years. And it's kind of evaporated now. We're living in suburbs, like especially the neighborhood I live across. I'm fortunate enough to live on like a 2-acre plot with wooded like kind of a surrounding. But majorities, you've heard of the McMansion term in America. Yeah. So you've got McMansion farms after McMansion farms. A lot of my buddies live there. I go there. It's sterile is like, I don't even know how to explain that. I mean, I don't want to be disparaging, but that's the way it is.
I know, man. That's the thing. And I think exactly what you point to, I think this joy thing is really important and somehow oddly forgotten. It's simply the pure joy of being in the city or in the neighborhood together. I think it's kind of under articulated how joyful it is, how fun it is, even though it can also, of course, be problematic and conflictual. And it's not that neighborhood life is always just joyful. It can also be, you can be tensions, but I think it's just, no matter how you look at it, it's more fun than being on the goddamn, excuse my French, phone or Facebook or, screens. I think there's something about how, I think we're increasingly aware of how much attention that is being sucked out of us from big corporations and sucking our attention into, let's say, to the cloud in a way. And while that can be, of course, entertaining and even educational at times, I think we simply need to invest in the social infrastructure, spatial social infrastructure, because it's so important also for our health and our mental health. And you see, of course, a massive increase in the Western societies of loneliness, of mental illness, of obesity. And that, I think that has a lot of, I know, and it's also proven by all kinds of studies, this has a lot to do with our urban environments. So let's say Copenhagen, where I'm from, everybody bikes. And of course, that means everybody's in a better health, and we less pollution, and it's more fun, and we say hi on the bikes, and on a bike you can socialize. You can stop if somebody says hi, Christian. In a car you're surrounded by a ton of metal that kind of makes you literally fenced off from your surroundings.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of it has to do with, let's say, infrastructure. And you asked whether I think we're at kind of a turning point. Yes, I think we are. I think we need to, of course, talk about these issues and try to do things differently. But my sad analysis is that 95% of what's being built across the planet is old school modernist stupidity. It's car-based, it's short-sighted, it's super polluting, it's not well conceived, it's not social. It's just badly planned and badly built urban stuff. And that's why, of course, I'm on fire for this mission, and why I'm being manifest about it. I think that there's such huge commercial pressure on at least the bigger cities that we need to come back against that pressure with good answers and do it better.
Yeah, I for the very first time, like when I was reading the book, it occurred to me that we've kind of like fallen into this reality rather than kind of willing our way into it. Like thinking about designing your urban environment is such a sort of thing in the background, right? Like somebody else takes care of it. The city municipal corporation sort of does their thing. We pay our taxes to them, and then they sort of have the experts to do it. But the kind of point you're making, which makes so much sense to me, is that this is an integral part of our mental well-being, our happiness, like how we interact with our neighborhood, how we interact with our society, the various components that, the grocery store, the gym, the office space, and all of these things, like the way these are placed in a city, the way these are designed, and the aesthetics of it, and all of these things contribute to your happiness, period. Like,
Mhm.
you're ignoring the biggest elephant in the room by not being an active participant in designing these things. And to me, it's like I always kind of, like, it always like resonated with me, like when I travel abroad and things like that. When these initial years from India, traveling abroad, I would be like, man, these spaces look so nice. I'd be so, I'd intuitively think in my head, like, I'd be so nice here. I'd be sitting here in a warm little place. There's greenery around me. It'd be so nice. I always think that in my head, and nobody would talk about it. And so I thought, well, it's just probably just me. But then you kind of normalize it. You said this is the front and center of our well-being and happiness.
Mm-hmm. We are totally on the same page, and I have the same feeling. I have a feeling I'm saying something that's super obvious. It's like a no-brainer, and
Right.
and to some extent, I think it is. I mean, it is. I don't think the book necessarily is kind of full of radical new thoughts, but it's kind of a status report and a lot of, let's say, sound advice to what types of conversations we should be having. Maybe there's one. So the book, in short, has like a few different angles on the neighborhood forming issue, looking at social infrastructure, looking at physical infrastructure, streets, etc., looking at nature and biodiversity, and finally, and maybe most importantly, looking at what we could call urban governance and systems thinking. And maybe that is where we have, to some extent, the most ahead of us, I think, and maybe where we are stressing some aspects that hasn't been discussed so much in the urban discourse, which is indeed that we must look at urban development as something more than urban planning. We still need to plan. It's also a very functional thing to make a city. It's where does the garbage go? Where's the sewage system, and etc., power, and all that. But we should look at urban form, urban morphology as kind of an innovation process. It's much more complicated than just placing volumes. It's about, as you say, how do we socialize? Where do we connect? How do we meet? How do we understand the touch points of everyday people's lives? How does our lives, so to say, intertwine in each other's realities? And of course, there's not an easy answer to this. It's not like, okay, Christian, here has the formula. This is how you do it. But it's rather that now the question is almost totally absent. I mean, some good architects, of course, will mention it. Some good planners will reflect on it more or less actively. But on the political agenda, it's almost absent. Also in Scandinavia, maybe not so much in Denmark and Norway, is totally absent. So all innovation money goes to tech stuff and to reducing CO2, which is good. But there's almost no innovation investment in our built environment, which I think is such a weird thing. And that's what we're saying. We're saying we need to rewire the public systems, public-private systems, and the collaborative models between public and private actors to pursue a golden path to better neighborhoods.
Yeah, that's one of the key points I kind of wrote down to talk with you, is that, on one hand, since the 70s, we've had the Silicon Revolution, chips and computer and software and all of that that's happened in the last 50 years. But then this has not been this frontier has been neglected, so to speak, right? Like this kind of innovation in building your urban environments. How do you design, like this could be a very viable career path if we made that the frontier and said, okay, look, we need people who can think outside the box and specifically tailor it to that environment, that culture, that background, that heritage that they inherited, and that legacy of whatever is in that part of the city or town, and all the innovations kind of come along for that, and normalizing that as a career path for certain people, and make it, I don't know. I guess what I'm saying is that from what I can tell, because I'm very passionate about this particular subject, is that we never saw it as the next not tech revolution, but just another innovation realm, so to speak, right? Would you agree with that? Or
No,
I
I
think
think you're absolutely right, and maybe that's one of the problems that is also trying to discuss somewhat in the book, which is the question of value. What is considered as valuable, and what is value creation? And I guess it's very obvious to say, okay, you made a lot of chips; they can work in an operating system in a computer, and you can make money of it. So everybody understand that this is somehow a value because you can count it, right? In terms of
right.
megawatts or RAM or money, simply. So it's easy to count and calculate and understand. And therefore, there's also investors, people who want to do it. And here, when we talk about neighborhoods, there's not really a protagonist, right? So even the public sector, you could say, if you have a public sector that's strong and has resources, even for them, the neighborhood perspective is not so obvious, because neighbors, the local community can also be annoying and demanding and not agreeing with the public plans. So the neighborhood is, in a sense, it's everybody and nobody to a certain extent, right? Of course, there can be maybe some local associations, some communities around the school or the church, but it's not a formalized, let's say, administrative entity, at least not all the time. So who's actually, in whose interest is it to make a better everyday life? Yeah, maybe it's some politicians, and again, some ambitious civil servants, and maybe also some urban developers that, even though they have to make money, they also want to make a good job. And so there are people, of course, in all kinds of sectors that I think try to do these things when they work. But there's also a lot of people who don't give a fuck. They just want to build that shit and get it done with and sell it expensive and get rich. Or even in this public sector, they just want to get it done with without any hassle, without getting any problems, without making it too complicated. And the thing is, what you just mentioned about that local heritage and the community, it's complicated. It's not just building the same building you built, 3 weeks ago on another site. Local is complicated. It's a little bit more. It requires, understanding what's actually going on here. So there are things here that to some extent go against innovation, against monetizing it, commercializing it. But of course, I think what we need to do is to try to show that it actually creates value. So I think for the public sector, we need to show that if we make good cities, we actually reduce health costs, and we make people more, robust and less mental ill. So we can kind of show that there's kind of actually societal value created through good urban design and good community building. And maybe also we need to articulate a language for how much it just matters, because it's beautiful, because it's good, it's joyful. So I think there are two levels of, let's say, the value discussion we need to have is, yes, this actually saves money or creates value on a societal level because people are happier and fitter and, don't demand it so much, less conflict, maybe even less crime, etc. But then also just the more just existential, that this is how we form our lives. Let's make the best of it.
Yeah, and is there, like, as kind of like, I don't know if I read in the book, but is that one of the imperatives that came out of the book, that we have to have ways to properly quantify these benefits and present it in a language that is understandable to, like, this, let's say, the city officials or the people and things like that?
Yeah, let's say if you call it second order value creation in the book, which is indeed that we and some people are working on this already. Gale architects from Denmark and others are working on trying to quantify, let's say, these health benefits from urban design and urban planning. So I think that is an important part of it. But I also think the other part, let's say, the more existential and I don't know, life world experience of good neighborhoods, I think we also need to insist that there's a language beyond quantifiable. So I think we need to do both. Operate in let's say, the vocabulary of spreadsheets and quantifiable values, but also to try to rephrase in plain language. This matters. You look, use your eyes. I don't think we cannot reduce everything just to the spreadsheet, let's say, language. So I think we need to do both.
Yeah. It's a little bit of a cultural question for you, Christian, is that a lot of what you're describing there is, I would say, in the book, there's this sense that things are democratized. There's more local participation, people partaking in the overall kind of like, if it's a city planning, you're encouraging more participation from the local citizens, for example, to come together and throw in your ideas. And um, on one hand, and then you're also kind of like downplaying the whole like capitalist tendencies to make money and all of these things. So I kind of wonder, if I have to map this onto like America, for example, which is a highly capitalistic country, everything comes down to how much money can we make. If I make this investment, where's the money going to come? Where's the that kind of like, so is this more, is your intuitions more that this is suitable for the Scandinavian context because you have already that substrate, so to speak, the cultural substrate of, kind of a socialistic kind of mindset, so it's much easier to implement, or do you think this? I don't know. I don't know what you think about it, because I mean, the lot of the things you talk about there is not entirely like extreme capitalism. Like I think you touched upon it previously, but I don't know what you. I guess my question is that are you looking at it purely from a European kind of a socialistic lens?
That's a good question. Maybe to some extent I am, or we are looking from, let's say, our place in the world, and it was also a discussion whether how could we include other perspectives. But I guess to some extent we are in this book looking at the potentials of having a fairly activist, let's say, public sector. And of course, I believe that is a viable way for much more countries around the world or cities. But whether that's realistic, of course, it's not realistic in very poor countries with very bad governance and corrupt politicians, etc. So we are talking in that type of context. So I think it's important to say that especially in Norway, even that looks very social democratic. I would say the urban market is totally driven by capital, and maybe even to surprisingly extent. So it's really like it's just the good old capitalists that run the urban development. So here we also, let's say, trying to make an argument in our context that we need to remember, let's say, our social democratic roots, and it's also important to say that what we are suggesting is not that the state or the city authorities should do everything themselves, rather the opposite. This is the third way that we are saying that what the city or the public sector needs to do is to orchestrate a development environment, and let's say an ecology of stakeholders and knowledge holders in this realm, and they should work together to make great stuff. So I don't think that the city or the public sector they don't hold the answers themselves, but they need to open up and let's say curate or facilitate urban development processes much more actively than they normally do. And this is then inspired a little bit by the Italian American economist Mariana Mazzucato, where we have drawn the mission from a mission neighborhood. She wrote the mission economy. Moonshot Guide to Reforming Capitalists, I think is the subtitle. And that is indeed with the same idea that the state or the public sector needs to rewire the way it enables private capital and the civil society to engage with the public sector. Not just saying no or being, be more innovative, more open, more experimental. That's what we're trying to propose. And that I think every government should do it, and but of course it requires skills. It's not so easy. So yes and no to answer it. Maybe it is a little bit viewed from a Northern European context, but still I think in theory it should be right for everybody.
Yeah, I constantly try to. I mean, I lived half my life in India, half in the US, and so I kind of have two contexts in my mind. If I look at India, for example, a lot of this would be just a plain non-starter because, you've got public sector. When you talk about municipal corporations, for example, the government, aka the government, who collects your taxes and then is supposed to maintain your roads and build infrastructure and all of these things. Your earlier point about, you have to have a corruption-free government and things like that. I think that's going to be a challenge in a country like India, because you have a lot of people who have benefited from this for a very long time. They don't want to give up their power. They don't want to give up the kind of money that's coming in, the kind of privileges that come along with it. This is going to be 3x, 4x, 5x harder in a country like India, because you have to, first of all, fight against those forces. It's not just advocating for more people to participate in your local governance and design and things like that. It's just rewiring our minds to think, hey, this is, we have to exercise our agency here. We have to come to the table and say, we need a better neighborhood. And you're just not going to build like some brown strip mall on the side of the road because it makes commercial sense. It's more that we also want, appealing neighborhoods and things that make more sense to the local context. I don't know, I'm jumping around between India and the US. But I guess that
I have a comment here, because I think I understand what you're saying from that. It's difficult, so I totally agree.
Yeah.
But I think my maybe somewhat romantic hope and maybe gut feeling is that this mission, if you're able to establish a shared mission, you have come far. And I think that is even possible, at least in theory, in a whatever, outside Bangalore, in some little town, that the developer, he's also engaged. Maybe he has knows somebody, and so he's also like, yeah, I want to make a nice, I want to make a nice neighborhood,
Yeah.
And then then the city. Very often, I think the problem is that public sector responds in a uncreative and negative way. So no, you cannot build as much as you want. You have to build lower or less or in a different way, rather than see, okay, what can we do together? So if we then chip in with a school here, then maybe we can share this and that. So if you can open up for creativity and for shared purpose and visualize fantastic outcomes together, I think there's something to be said about that potential of creativity, of collaboration. But you need to do it, of course. It's a practice. You need to learn. You need to exercise it, like you need to exercise your body to become fit. But I don't think it's impossible. And I think I'm sure it also happens locally in India, all kinds of places where actually some local developer is pretty progressive with some local authorities. And of course, there's a lot of just stupid and awful projects going on at the same time. That's life. But I think we need to remain optimistic without being naive, and that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, to your point about optimism, I love the quote in the book where David Graeber, I think he's one of the people you quote there. He says, if you think one thing is possible, you can also, the same thing would be possible if you think the other thing. And I thought that's such a profound quote. Like, all you have to do is just think about the other thing, and then you can make that happen too. Yeah, I share that sentiment with you, Christian, that, like, I think this also ties back into that point, the point in the book, that people need to be more comfortable with not having crisp numbers and this little bit of uncertainty in design of things or the outcome of things, and all these kind of fine measurements about per capita GDP and all these things. Like maybe per capita GDP is a good number today. I'm not talking about that, but people should be. It's okay to have gray area. It's okay to have shades of gray in some spaces, and to have this notion that we're going to figure it out. It's just, we just don't have the answers now, and we just have to work through that. And it's a continuous process. It's a never-ending process. I think that's one of the key things that popped out at me in the book, is that this kind of partnership between the folks, the society, as well as the public sector, let's say, as well as the real estate commercial developers, is like, it's a constant collaboration. It's a continuous, like that Kaizen concept in Japan, like, that continuous improvement. Like, it never ends. You just have to keep working at it, and things are constantly evolving. We have to adapt to the circumstances, technology, and things like that. And being comfortable with that kind of constant evolution.
Yeah, I think two things that I'm very I agree with, and maybe can add a little perspective too. I think the first part is indeed we need to accept the gray areas and accept, let's say, a certain lack of control, and this is very intuitive for both the developers who fear nothing more than risk. Developers do not like risk, and also bureaucrats. They don't like risk either, right? They want to keep their budgets,
Right.
and they get, they have to make the case within 3 months. There's all these kind of regulations and let's say systems powers that basically goes towards controlling outcomes. It's understandable, but it's also if it's overdone, it's super destructive for the result of our urban environments and maybe also other things. So here, I think it's important to find ways to share risk that the public sector can actually make it more attractive for developers to do good. So this is all about incentive structures. Today, a developer is basically being rewarded for just doing what it says in the building code. But what if we could make it more attractive to do good? Of course, both in terms of sustainability, but maybe also adding to the quality of the neighborhood. And then you can say to the developer, yes, Mr. Developer X, you can build 3 more floors that you could on the top that makes your building much more valuable, because of these you can sell expensively. If indeed you make a nice park, or so this is all like let's say the bartering you can do in such a development process, and it's basically opening up for some uncertainty, but also some more systemic understanding on both sides of the table. We are building societies. We are building everyday realities. It's not just a box. This is important, right? And that's what. So reminding people of, let's say, the epic aspect of what they do. And I think if you sit in some shithole city in the Midwest, you can be like, "What the fuck am I doing?" You're building the future. This is important. So it's also something about just reminding ourselves of the importance of what we are doing. And I think also many, also maybe even greedy American capitalists, on a good day in church, they also know, we must do something good here. So it's also a big cultural, let's say, push. And of course, it doesn't happen with one book and some good intentions from Norway, but
and a podcast.
we do what we can.
We do what we can. Just for the viewers, I'm not in a shithole city in Midwest. I mean, a lot of people call it that, but it's a small little town. I love this town, man, and I have hope for this town. It's given me everything I need, everything I could ever hope for in my life. But having said that, there's always enormous opportunity to I can't get over this. I watched some videos of Norway, like this guy Anton Somewhere. He's like this YouTuber. I don't know if you've heard of him. For folks who haven't watched Anton Somewhere, check him out. He went on a tour starting from the south of Norway, I think, all the way to the north, like driving and hiking and everything. I mean, there's not a single town with an ice. I mean, of course, this is on my Indian eyes, American eyes looking at it. There's not a single town that has an eyesore building or a road that has like a sidewalk that's kind of broken or something like that. It's just like,
that was just, this is editing.
This is editing, Rajiv.
Trust me, there is a lot of shit in Norway. And by the way, I didn't want to say anything bad about the Midwest. Certainly, I wasn't thinking about you.
No, I know you didn't.
But all the small places where you work with like some regulation plan that might not be so.
Oh yeah.
But I think that I have to say Norway is also very beautiful. I'm also a great fan of my new home country here, and certainly the nature is outstanding. Yeah. But I would maybe argue, in fact, the opposite, that the fact that there's so much beautiful nature has made them a little bit reckless with the urban environments, because they can always, just go out of and in nature it's beautiful. So they have a lot of space. So they're also quite inefficient, with like a lot of, let's say, non-space, and also quite driver or car oriented. I would not idealize Norwegian planning, I have to say. I think it's actually... I think it's underwhelming, certainly considering the amount of money that's in this country, and also how well educated people are, and the potential of doing really good urban planning. I'm not so impressed. But there's also, I would say, winds of change, and people are becoming better. So I'm again, trying to be optimistic.
Yeah, I share the Midwest sentiment with you as well. Is that, as much as I've talked about my hometown, it's like a template design. You go to any city in the Midwest, it's just like the same strip in the middle of the town, and there's so much beauty, there's so much culture, there's so much heritage around all of these places. There's barns that are fantastically American. That's pure American culture distilled into it, right? Like, why don't we bring that into the center of our living? And why isn't that part of our, like, our day-to-day, like, commute or things like that? Like, I'm totally with you on that. Well, there's a point that and if I'm mischaracterizing, I apologize, but there's a point, there's a part of the book that talks a lot about Paris and how they've managed to do a lot of these small innovations to make their city better. Can you talk to, I guess, why that is in Paris specifically, and how did they achieve that?
I can indeed. So this article that you refer to is it's a conversation I have with Carlos Moreno, who's French, a Colombian French professor, lives in Paris, and he worked a lot with the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, under the headline of the 15-minute city. So he's somewhat famous for this idea that you should be able to reach everything within 15 minutes, or on foot, or by bike, or not by car. So you should have basically access to everything in your neighborhood, including place to work and exercise and culture and education, etc. Right? So we should think about the bigger cities as multi-centric. So rather than everybody having to go into the center to do interesting things or work, we want to have more diversity of functions in the bigger urban context. So, for example, in Paris, we should try to have more local centers that are more rich in offering what you can do in an everyday. So I think this has been a really highly profile ambition from Anne Hidalgo and so the mayor of Paris. And one of the things they did that I think is quite genius is to look at the schools. So school is a very important neighborhood driver because people have to go, to pick up their kids, and or the kids go themselves if you're lucky. But anyways, this is a very kind of essential
focal point
piece in the neighborhood game, because people actually have a functional, reason to go every day. In Paris, many kids have been driven by car, super complicated, adds traffic, pollutes, and etc. And there was also often there's a lot of cars in front of the schools. So what they've done, which I think is quite brilliant, is that they have actually made an initiative that all streets in front of schools in Paris, 169, will be the street will be replaced with a park or a public square or a plaza or sorts. So it's a very literal way of saying we prioritize at local social infrastructure. Now kids can stand with their parents outside the school and talk. Parents can talk to each other, and we're prioritizing this kind of shared public space in front of the school. A neighborhood enabler, a community enabler you've created, rather than just a polluting and noisy street. So I think it's a good example. But what Carlos Moreno is on a more strategic level talking about is this kind of multi-centric city approach. Let's spread out functions outside the center and make more neighborhoods more self-sustainable, notably to avoid commuting hours across the city, again, polluting, taking space up with the car, wasting time. So this idea that we want to have more of our lives where we live, and that is neighborhood thinking.
Yeah, and do you have any sense of how difficult it was to achieve something like that, the 169 schools?
So I think they're around 50 now, and that's in the book we have some nice before and after pictures, and I guess it's kind of easy to understand and appreciate. The bigger Paris planning process, of course, is super complicated, and also a lot of different levels of the city authorities. But I think the bigger ambition of Paris is to try to distribute power more locally. So it has to do with the local council, the city councils of the smaller areas in Paris, but also to motivate other public actors, the schools, kindergartens, cultural institutions, other, let's say, public service functions, elderly care, etc. How are these public institutions tied to the neighborhood? Do they have a neighborhood relation? Often they don't. They just position there, and they have no, let's say, they're not measured whether they are good neighborhood actors, but they're trying to make them aware that we should all think of ourselves as neighborhood enablers or neighborhood actors to an extent. And that is the bigger, more, let's say, complicated ambition of Carlos Moreno and Paris. And how that goes, I think we will see. It's not easy, of course, to change a super big cities physical infrastructure, but I know that they are trying, and they're also trying to address, of course, a lot of the social issues, which goes from the fact that you have ghettos with only immigrants, nothing to do. It's not that the immigrants, it's just that that's where they live, kind of in a closed off part of town.
Yeah.
But if you infuse new institutions, workplaces, things to do, that is also addressing some of the social issues and the social segregation. That's, of course, a huge issue in many bigger cities.
Yeah.
One thing, I guess they also go, of course, for an Indian context, but can you grant some of the luxury and the privileges that are often localized in the center to more people outside the center? That is the main, I think, solidaric and urbanistic vision from Anne Hidalgo, Mayor Paris, and Carlos Moreno.
Yeah, it's such a again, a very grassroots idea, it seems to me, but also solves some very hard problems, like how do immigrants assimilate into culture and things like that. Like, I've always heard kind of like speaking about immigrants in a derisive way, not integrating into society, assimilating, but never like a positive tone. Like, how do we, okay, immigration is always going to happen. That's happened throughout human history. And well, how do we make it such that it's more harmonious, the integration happens much more seamlessly, and it doesn't have to lead to problems. It doesn't have to lead to this kind of friction between the local population, the immigrant population. It's a very common sense solution.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think, though, you say it's kind of a grassroots perspective. I think what we're trying to say, and I think also Carlos Moreno would agree, that it's about how can the public systems or the public actors enable grassroots activities, but also local commercial activities. How can the public sector take responsibility to make it easier to engage in the local environment? So I think we do not get local environments to thrive just by counting on grassroots. That is too optimistic. We need to work systemically with the bigger actors, which, of course, maybe more in Europe than in the US, are public actors. So it's the schools, it's the kindergartens, it's the hospitals, it's the elderly homes, it's the cultural institutions, it's the et cetera, right? So it's also the train stations, the bus stops, it's the maybe the car sharing hubs. So it's all these places where we come together, these actors and these functional aspects of everyday life. It could even be the supermarkets. They need to be a part of this type of thinking and this type of solution to avoid, let's say, the disintegration of our urban environments. That is our main argument. Everybody needs to chip in, and that can be orchestrated from top down. You can say that as a political ambition, as it's been done in Paris. So it's not being you're sitting and waiting for local things to happen. It's saying it's our responsibility from the public sector to not to do it ourselves, but to fertilize the soil for this to happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's a paradigm shift in the way we live our lives, right? Like when the first time I found out that my father-in-law, who lives in a small town by the name here, he used to be in the school board, even though he worked at the railroad. He worked at the railroad for many decades, but then for 18 years he served on the school board thanklessly. I mean, this was just an unpaid gig where you would go and sit on the school board and then plan with what kind of resources we need to provide to the kids, what kind of sports facilities we need to build, and blah blah blah, and all these things. And when I heard about that, I was like, what is this alien concept that they're talking about? Like, what does it mean to go hang out in your school board meetings, and every week you had this meeting, and then you had to spend 2 hours of your time instead you could be spending with your family? I never, I mean, like, can you imagine? I never heard of this. It was such an alien concept.
But I think there's an important point to this, which is I think people like to do good, and people like to do good together if they get the opportunity, if there's a context for people. I don't think people. I think actually nobody's dream is sit at home and watch Netflix. It can be nice, it's comfortable.
Are you sure?
Is it anybody's dream? Hardly. But
Yeah.
the fact that the way that we designed our lives made that the most likely thing for most people to do in the Western world, I would say, is exactly that. Have dinner with their family, if they're lucky to have one, and then turn on Netflix or whatever, you know?
Yeah.
But I think people are longing to contribute, to give, to create, to produce together, and to be a part of something. And they think this is also the case in, let's say, the most Trumpist part of America. I think many of these people, they're just frustrated, they are lonely, and they feel that they've been left behind by the train. But if they could actually be a part of something, which then, sadly enough, they get in some MAGA demonstration, I find that it's kind of like we need to make it possible for people to be seen and to contribute. And there, I think the neighborhood scale is an interesting scale to think about these things. How can you contribute? Because if it's too abstract, you know, your dad-in-law would not sit in some board if it's about some crazy abstract thing. But since it's the local school, he can relate to it. He might know somebody there. So this kind of like, it's not private, but it's not the whole continent. It's like the scale of the neighborhood is kind of a reasonable scale of engagement, I think.
Yeah. How do you propose some of these things happen in a, well, Paris is one example we just talked about, but you know, a built up city like Bangalore, India, like it's extremely built up. It's just bursting at the seams because of lack of planning and things like that. There's a lot of like real basic issues there. But you know, my intuition in this space is that we almost need, like, when you talk about like people want to partake and do the right thing, there was actually one data point I have is that there was a group called the Ugly Indian, TUI. I think they had a Facebook page back in 2010, 2011. And they were a group of tech people from Bangalore who got together and said, okay, we're going to clean up our city. We're going to do it our way. And we're going to paint all these underpasses and flyovers and all of these public places. And they did it. And I followed them for a long time. So I agree with you on that. But also, I don't know. I think you might have answered this. That you start with a small town, like on the outskirts of Bangalore, for example, like make it a prototype, make it look good, make it so that people understand what you're talking about rather than in abstract terms. And it's a more of a concrete example where people could say, in the Indian context, given the diversity of religions, people of different races and all of that stuff in Bangalore, we can still make this happen. And then that kind of slowly percolates into the people's minds. Is that I don't know, it seems like
I mean, of course, it is also just a business, but I agree, and I think the way forward is the good example. It is trial and error. It's trying to create a richer language of what urban development means, and to build a discourse of let's say the touch points of everyday life, which is like that is maybe a definition of the neighborhoods. That is the touch points we share, right? So the bus stop, kindergarten, the cafe, or whatever it is, different in India, but it's where our lives are interwoven in each other's lives, right? And trying to build a language of that, and trying to engage the actors that then builds or operates these touch points to get them on board in this kind of thinking. And then I guess maybe there was an earlier point too, this notion of, can you build shared visions and aspirations for how we would like Bangalore to be greener or more socially just or more creative. And I think the idea of underscoring the potential of human creativity and what we can actually accomplish together, and trying to carve out images of the types of urban environments we could create, that is key. And then, as you say, we do it one step at a time. And of course, it's also just a messy process, and there's no quick fix, etc. But but at least we can start to build a vocabulary that counter narrates the capital makes it functional and blah blah blah. I mean, there's such immense amounts of waste in the way our urban environment is being produced, both in terms of sustainability, but also just in waste of opportunities and potentials. So that's what we are trying to argue, that we can do it better, of course. And then I think the examples is a very important part of that road, which is what you said.
Yeah. I as we were talking, I could think of one example. Think of Austin, Texas, in the U.S. It's like it's in the right bang in the middle of a very conservative kind of a Republican state, but they managed to kind of have that ethos of like the liberal, extreme liberalism, and they have this kind of tagline, "Keep Austin weird." Have you heard of that?
I know it.
And I think that sort of percolates in the kind of the zeitgeist, right? Like everybody sort of thinks that, and if something weird popped up, nobody's gonna just nobody's eyes going to pop up because it's just weird. It's just, Austin. And that sort of percolates and this perpetuates, and it's kind of built on itself in that sense.
Well, I think it's a great example because it points to this, that they have a vision in a way. They want Austin to be something.
Right.
And in this case, not just the A4 version of a city. They want a rich, weird, thriving environment, right? And then that kind of cultural, let's say, nerve will, of course, then inform both the bureaucrats and the developers and the music scene or whatever, who's making the city together. And I think that is the most fundamental fact, is that our urban environments, they are shared. They are ours. We are there together. And it's also fair to say that I don't think we need to be friends with everybody and over-socialize. And it's also, cities are also a place of conflict and of different types of interests.
Right.
But still we have this collective potential that we need to let's say, pursue. On a more personal note, I need to pick up my son.
Yeah.
We have 5 minutes left, I would say, before I have to do a very neighborhoody thing, which is walking 300 meters across a little square to pick up my son in the kindergarten.
Hey, no worries, Christian. I'm so thankful that you gave me your time. It's we've crossed an hour mark, so I think I covered most of the topics that I want to get into anyway. I really appreciate your time, man. This is fantastic. I can't wait to share this with the rest of the world. And more power to guys like you who are thinking in this kind of broader, optimistic vision for humanity, man. Because there's so much like darkness, and there's like pessimism and cynicism and all of that. Like, and the fact that you guys are like, I don't know if this is a bootstrap operation. You guys are a big organization, but the fact that you have this optimism just energizes me. I'm thrilled like guys like you exist, and more power to you.
Thank you, Rajiv, and just to be patching each other's backs. Thank you for being interested and picking up the conversation. I appreciate the interest and the fact that you're passionate about these things and you're spreading the good word. So thanks for the good conversation, and we'll stay in touch. You should get a copy of the book, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks, Christian. Have a good Friday.
Take care.
All right. Bye.